Part 1. Before we begin tonight's journey, I wanted to check in with you. Are you comfortable? Have you found that perfect position where your body can finally let go of the day's tensions? Good. Take a moment to breathe deeply, in through your nose, out through your mouth. Let the weight of the world settle away from your shoulders. If you enjoy stories like these, feel free to like and subscribe. It helps more people find our sleepy little corner of the internet, where the strange and the soothing meet under the cover of darkness. Tonight, we'll explore two of the most intimate alien encounters ever reported. Stories that push the boundaries of believability, yet refuse to be dismissed entirely. Tales of contact that go far beyond simple sightings or abductions, venturing into territory that is, shall we say, remarkably personal. In the annals of unidentified flying object encounters, most stories follow familiar patterns: a light in the sky, a moment of missing time, perhaps a glimpse of strange beings with large eyes and elongated limbs. But occasionally, very occasionally, witnesses report something far more extraordinary, something that transcends the usual boundaries between species, between worlds, between what we consider possible and what we desperately hope remains impossible. These are not your typical close encounters. These are accounts that venture into the most private aspects of human experience, reported by individuals who had no apparent reason to invite such scrutiny, such ridicule, such profound questioning of their sanity. Yet they spoke, they testified, they endured decades of skepticism and analysis, maintaining their stories with a consistency that is either remarkably dedicated to deception or disturbingly authentic. The first modern wave of unidentified flying object reports began in earnest in the late 1940s, following Kenneth Arnold's famous sighting of flying saucers near Mount Rainier. Arnold, a businessman and experienced pilot, described objects moving like saucers skipping across water, forever changing how humanity would think about the possibility of visitors from other worlds. His account opened floodgates of similar reports from pilots, military personnel, and civilians across the globe. By the 1950s, the phenomena had evolved from simple lights in the sky to more complex encounters. Witnesses began reporting direct contact with occupants of these mysterious craft. The progression seemed almost inevitable in retrospect. First distant lights, then structured objects, then beings, and finally interaction. And by the late 50s, a few brave or perhaps foolish souls began reporting encounters of a very different nature entirely. The 1950s were a time of extraordinary change in human understanding of our place in the universe. The space age was dawning with Sputnik's launch. Nuclear weapons had demonstrated humanity's capacity for both creation and destruction on unprecedented scales, and the possibility of life beyond Earth was transitioning from science fiction fantasy to serious scientific consideration. Scientists like Frank Drake were beginning to calculate the probability of extraterrestrial intelligence, while popular culture was simultaneously fascinated and terrified by the implications of contact. It was against this backdrop of expanding consciousness and technological capability that reports of intimate alien contact first emerged. These accounts challenged not only our understanding of what was possible in terms of interplanetary travel, but also our assumptions about the motivations and methods of any intelligence capable of reaching Earth from the depths of space. These early accounts shared certain characteristics that would become familiar patterns in later reports: humanoid beings with advanced technology, medical examinations conducted with clinical precision, and sexual encounters that seemed to combine scientific research with reproductive purposes. The beings were typically described as having large heads, prominent eyes, and slender bodies, features that would become iconic in popular representations of aliens for decades to come. The witnesses were typically ordinary individuals with no background in science fiction or previous interest in extraterrestrial phenomena. lending an air of authenticity to accounts that might otherwise be dismissed as fantasy. They were farmers, mechanics, housewives, and labourers, people whose daily lives revolved around practical concerns rather than cosmic speculation. What drives someone to come forward with such deeply personal, inherently unbelievable claims? The question haunts every researcher who has studied these cases. Perhaps it's the human need to make sense of the impossible, to find meaning in experiences that challenge every assumption about the nature of reality. Perhaps it's trauma-seeking expression through the only framework available when conventional explanations prove inadequate. Or perhaps, just perhaps, these witnesses experienced exactly what they claim to experience. The possibility cannot be dismissed lightly, particularly when the accounts display such consistency across different cultures, time periods, and individual backgrounds. The details vary, but the underlying patterns remain remarkably stable. Medical examination, reproductive focus, and the profound personal impact on the witnesses. Tonight we'll explore two such accounts, each extraordinary in its own way, each carrying its own unique burden of strangeness. These are not stories of distant lights or fleeting glimpses, but detailed accounts of prolonged, intimate contact that change the lives of those who experienced them. We'll visit a young Brazilian farmer whose evening of tractor repair turned into something far more complicated than he bargained for. An encounter that would establish the template for intimate alien contact reports for decades to come. His story emerged in an era when such accounts were virtually unknown, making his detailed testimony all the more remarkable for its novelty and specificity. Then we'll meet an Australian man whose suburban bedroom became the scene of an encounter that defied every assumption about interstellar diplomacy, and provided what may be the first concrete physical evidence of non-human genetic material on Earth. His case would transform the study of alleged alien contact from purely testimonial accounts to scientific investigation based on material evidence. These stories come to us filtered through decades of investigation, analysis, and retelling. They've been examined by psychologists seeking to understand the human mind's capacity for creating elaborate false memories, debunked by skeptics determined to find conventional explanations for extraordinary claims, embraced by believers looking for validation of their own experiences or convictions, and endlessly dissected by researchers who can't quite decide what to make of them. What remains constant across all this scrutiny is the vivid detail, the emotional authenticity, and the profound strangeness that seems too elaborate to be fabricated, too bizarre to be real. The witnesses maintain their stories with a consistency that either speaks to remarkable dedication to deception or the persistent power of genuine memory, however impossible that memory might seem. The cultural impact of these accounts extends far beyond their immediate witnesses. They have shaped our collective imagination about the nature of possible contact with extraterrestrial intelligence, influencing everything from Hollywood films to scientific protocols for first contact scenarios. They have challenged our assumptions about consent, privacy, and the boundaries between species, forcing us to consider uncomfortable questions about what contact with advanced alien civilizations might actually entail. In examining these accounts, we must also consider the broader context of human sexuality and its relationship to the unknown. Throughout history, encounters with the divine, the supernatural, and the inexplicable have often carried sexual overtones, from mythological accounts of gods mating with mortals to religious visions involving spiritual marriage and physical transformation. The intimate nature of these alien encounters may reflect deep psychological patterns that connect sexuality with transcendence, reproduction with contact with the infinite. The medical aspects of these encounters also deserve consideration. Both of our witnesses reported being subjected to examinations and procedures that seemed designed to analyze human biology and reproductive capacity. This clinical focus suggests either a scientific purpose to the encounters or psychological symbolism related to medical trauma and bodily violation. The distinction between genuine alien research and human psychological processing of medical experiences remains one of the most challenging aspects of interpreting these accounts. From a sociological perspective, these stories emerged during periods of significant social change regarding sexuality, gender roles, and reproductive freedom. The late 1950s and early 1990s were both times when traditional assumptions about sexual behavior and reproductive autonomy were being challenged and redefined. The timing of these accounts may reflect broader cultural anxieties about changing social norms and the loss of traditional certainties about human identity and purpose. The scientific revolution of the 20th century had already begun to challenge fundamental assumptions about the nature of reality, from quantum mechanics revealing the strange behavior of subatomic particles to relativity theory overturning Newton's absolute space and time. Against this backdrop of expanding knowledge and shifting paradigms, reports of alien contact seemed less impossible than they might have in earlier eras. So settle in, let your breathing slow, and prepare for a journey into the most intimate corners of the unexplained. These are stories that whisper of possibilities we're not sure we want to consider, of contact that goes far beyond the clinical exchange of information between civilizations. These are tales of connection in its most primal form, played out against a backdrop of stars and questions that may never find answers. As we explore these accounts, remember that we approach them not as definitive truth or obvious fiction, but as windows into the complexity of human experience and the persistent mystery of consciousness itself. Whether these encounters represent genuine contact with non-human intelligence, psychological phenomena that reveal hidden aspects of human nature, or something else entirely, they invite us to expand our understanding of what might be possible in a universe that continues to surprise us with its strangeness and wonder. Part 2, The Brazilian Farmer, Antonio Villas Boas, 1957. Our first tale takes us to the rolling hills of São Francisco de Sales, in the Brazilian state of Minas Gerais, where autumn arrives in October and the nights carry the promise of rain. The year was 1957, and 23-year-old Antonio Villas Boas was exactly the sort of practical young man you'd expect to find operating farm machinery, and worrying about crop yields rather than pondering the mysteries of the cosmos. Villas Boas worked his family's farm with the dedication of someone who understood that survival depended on attention to detail, hard work, and an appreciation for the predictable rhythms of agricultural life. The farm itself was modest but productive, specializing in corn, beans, and other staple crops that fed both the family and provided a small surplus for market sales in the nearby town. He was, by all accounts, a straightforward individual with no particular interest in science fiction, no history of wild stories, and no apparent reason to fabricate what would become one of the most detailed and intimate alien encounter reports in the historical record. His education was practical rather than academic, focused on the skills needed to manage land, livestock, and machinery, rather than abstract theories or imaginative speculation. The Villas Boas family had worked this land for generations, accumulating the kind of deep practical knowledge that comes only from intimate familiarity with soil conditions, weather patterns, and seasonal cycles. Antonio was being groomed to take over the operation from his father, learning not just the technical aspects of farming, but also the business skills needed to navigate markets, negotiate with suppliers, and manage the complex logistics of agricultural production. This background of rural pragmatism would later lend considerable credibility to his extraordinary claims. Investigators found it difficult to believe that such a down-to-earth individual, with no apparent motive for seeking attention or fame, would fabricate a story so elaborate and bizarre. His lack of exposure to science fiction literature or films of the era meant that he had no obvious source for the detailed technical descriptions that would characterize his account. The events began, as these things often do, with something apparently unrelated to interplanetary visitation. On the evening of October 15th, 1957, Villas Boas was working late, using his tractor to plough a field that needed to be prepared for planting. The work was behind schedule due to equipment problems earlier in the week, and he was taking advantage of the cooler nighttime temperatures to catch up. Working by moonlight was a common practice among farmers in the region, particularly during the warmer months when daytime temperatures could make heavy labour uncomfortable and potentially dangerous. The October night was clear and bright, with a full moon providing adequate illumination for the careful work of preparing furrows for the next season's crops. The particular field that Villas Boas was preparing was located some distance from the main farmhouse, isolated enough that he could work without disturbing sleeping family members, but remote enough that he was essentially alone in the vast Brazilian countryside. The nearest neighbours were several kilometres away, and the night sounds were limited to insects, small animals, and the steady rhythm of his tractor engine. According to Villas Boas, the first sign that this would not be an ordinary night of farm work appeared around 1 o'clock in the morning. A bright light appeared in the northern sky, moving with purpose and intensity that immediately caught his attention. At first he assumed it might be an aircraft, though the nearest airport was hundreds of kilometres away, and air traffic over the region was virtually non-existent at that time of night. The light was, in his later descriptions, too bright to be a star, too controlled to be a meteor, and too solitary to be an aircraft of any familiar design. It moved in patterns that defied conventional explanation, executing turns and accelerations that seemed to violate basic principles of physics and aerodynamics as he understood them from his limited exposure to mechanical systems. It would hover motionless for several minutes, allowing Villas Boas to observe its steady, unwavering glow, then suddenly dart across the sky at what appeared to be impossible speeds, only to stop again with the sort of precision that suggested intelligent control rather than natural phenomena or mechanical failure. The movement seemed deliberate and purposeful, as if whoever or whatever controlled the light was conducting some form of systematic observation. Villas Boas, for reasons best known to himself, chose not to flee. Perhaps it was curiosity, perhaps stubbornness, or perhaps simply the practical farmer's refusal to abandon necessary work because of unexplained phenomena. Instead, he continued his ploughing, keeping one eye on the furrows he was creating and another on the mysterious light that seemed to be observing his midnight agricultural efforts. The light circled the area several times, maintaining what appeared to be a consistent altitude and distance, as if conducting some sort of aerial survey of the field and surrounding countryside. Its behaviour suggested purposeful observation rather than random movement or equipment malfunction. After perhaps 20 minutes of this systematic circling, it disappeared into the distance with what the farmer later described as impossible speed, leaving him alone with his tractor and his growing sense that something extraordinary was occurring. Any reasonable person might have considered this sufficient strangeness for one evening. The appearance of an unidentified light displaying seemingly impossible flight characteristics would certainly qualify as a notable event worth discussing with friends and family. Villas Boas, however, demonstrated either remarkable courage or remarkable stubbornness by returning to the same field the following night. On October 16th, he was accompanied by his brother João, who had expressed both curiosity and concern about Antonio's report of the previous evening's events. The decision to return suggests either a scientific mindset seeking to verify unusual observations, or simply a practical farmer's refusal to be intimidated by unexplained phenomena that might interfere with necessary agricultural work. The light appeared again on the second night, displaying the same pattern of circular observation before departing with the same inexplicable velocity. João Villas Boas witnessed the entire display, providing important corroboration for his brother's account and eliminating the possibility that the first night's events had been hallucination or misidentification of conventional phenomena. Jerome's reaction was apparently one of mounting alarm as he watched the light execute maneuvers that violated everything he understood about the capabilities of known aircraft. Unlike his brother, he possessed more conventional survival instincts and strongly suggested they abandon their nocturnal farming activities and return to the safety of their home. His testimony would later provide crucial support for Antonio's credibility, as it established that the unusual light was observed by multiple witnesses before the more extraordinary events that would follow. But Antonio Villas Boas was either remarkably brave or remarkably stubborn. On October 17th, he returned alone to complete his ploughing work, determined not to allow mysterious lights to interfere with the practical necessities of farm management. This decision would prove to be either extremely foolish or extraordinarily fortunate, depending on one's perspective regarding the value of intimate contact with extraterrestrial intelligence. The third night would transform Villas Boas from an anonymous farmer into one of the most famous alleged contactees in the history of unidentified flying object research. According to his later testimony to investigators, the light appeared again around 1 o'clock in the morning, but this time it did not maintain its previous polite distance. Instead of circling at a safe altitude, the object descended toward the field, revealing itself to be something far more complex than a simple light. As it approached, Villas Boas could see that it was egg-shaped, or perhaps more accurately described as resembling an elongated oval, glowing with a reddish light that seemed to emanate from its entire surface, rather than from specific illumination sources. The craft was equipped with what appeared to be a rotating dome on its upper surface, spinning slowly and emitting flashes of coloured light that created an almost hypnotic effect against the dark sky. The rotation seemed steady and purposeful, perhaps serving some navigational or observational function that was beyond the farmer's ability to comprehend. As the object came closer, more details became visible in the strange reddish glow. The craft's size was impressive, approximately 35 feet in length and perhaps 15 feet in height, large enough to accommodate multiple occupants and sophisticated equipment, while remaining small enough to land in a ploughed field without requiring extensive clear space. Its surface appeared to be metallic, but with a quality that seemed to absorb and reflect light in ways that made accurate observation difficult. The material looked smooth and seamless, without visible joints, seams, or other construction details that might provide clues about its origin or method of manufacture. The overall design suggested advanced engineering principles that owed nothing to terrestrial aeronautical traditions. The craft landed in the field with what the farmer described as surprising gentleness, touching down perhaps 50 yards from where he sat on his tractor, suddenly feeling very alone and very exposed in the Brazilian countryside. 3 telescoping legs extended from the craft's underside to support it on the uneven ground, suggesting sophisticated landing systems designed to accommodate various terrain conditions. A soft humming sound became audible once the craft had settled, suggesting some form of power source or life support system operating within the vessel. The sound was low and steady, almost musical in its consistency, unlike the harsh mechanical noises associated with conventional engines or generators. The tractor's engine, which had been running reliably all evening, chose this moment to fail completely, leaving Villas Boas in silence, broken only by the humming from the spacecraft and the natural sounds of the nighttime countryside. The engine failure was complete and instantaneous, as if some external force had simply switched off all electrical and mechanical systems simultaneously. This electromagnetic effect, if that's what it was, would become a commonly reported feature of close encounters with unidentified craft. The failure of electrical and mechanical systems in the presence of these objects suggests either deliberate interference or simply the byproduct of whatever exotic propulsion or power systems they employ. At this point in most encounter stories, the witness either flees in terror or experiences a period of missing time during which memories become fragmentary or disappear entirely. Villas Boas, however, appears to have been gifted with an almost supernatural ability to observe and remember details while under extraordinary stress. He watched with fascination and growing apprehension as a door opened in the side of the craft. The opening appeared seamlessly in what had seemed to be a smooth, unbroken surface, sliding silently aside to reveal an interior illuminated by the same reddish light that surrounded the exterior of the vessel. Several figures emerged from the craft, and they were unmistakably not from the local farming community, or indeed from anywhere on Earth. The beings, according to his detailed later accounts, were humanoid but distinctly non-human in their proportions and features, standing approximately 5 feet tall and moving with a coordination that suggested either extensive practice or a completely different relationship with gravity than the one Villas Boas was accustomed to. They wore what appeared to be tight-fitting grey coveralls that might have been clothing, or perhaps specialised skin, and their movements possessed a fluid quality that seemed to ignore normal considerations of balance and momentum. Their heads were proportionally larger than human heads, with features that were recognisably facial, but arranged according to different aesthetic principles than those governing human appearance. Their eyes were larger than normal human proportions would suggest, and seemed to reflect light in ways that created an unsettling impression of depth and intelligence. Their noses were smaller and less prominent than typical human features, while their mouths seemed designed more for breathing than for the complex vocalizations that characterize human speech. The beings wore what appeared to be protective helmets made of a transparent material that might have been glass or some advanced plastic, suggesting either that Earth's atmosphere was not entirely suitable for their respiratory needs, or that they were following safety protocols designed to prevent contamination in either direction. Through these helmets, Villas Boas could observe their facial features in detail, noting characteristics that were almost human, but subtly wrong, in ways that created an unsettling uncanny valley effect. Their skin appeared pale and smooth, almost translucent in the strange lighting, and their overall appearance suggested beings who had evolved under different environmental pressures than those that had shaped human development. Now, any sensible person finding themselves in such circumstances might reasonably be expected to run, hide, or at the very least attempt some form of communication. The sudden appearance of obviously non-human beings in a remote field would certainly justify immediate flight to safety. Villas Boas, however, chose a different approach that speaks either to remarkable courage or remarkable foolishness. His first instinct was to attempt to start his tractor and escape, a plan that might have worked had the engine shown any inclination to cooperate. The mechanical systems remained completely unresponsive, leaving him stranded in his field with no means of rapid escape. When mechanical reliability failed him, he dismounted from the tractor and attempted to flee on foot across the ploughed field, a strategy that proved no more successful than his vehicular escape plan. The ploughed field, which had been perfectly suitable for tractor operation, proved to be treacherous terrain for panicked flight. The loose soil and irregular furrows created obstacles that slowed Villas Boas's escape, while providing no impediment to his pursuers, who seemed to glide across the uneven ground with the sort of effortless mobility that suggested either advanced technology or simply superior physical adaptation to the conditions. The beings, displaying what can only be described as remarkable efficiency, quickly surrounded and apprehended the fleeing farmer. Villas Boas reported that they communicated among themselves in sounds that reminded him of barking or yelping, a detail that adds nothing to the dignity of first contact between species, but certainly contributes to the overall surreal quality of the encounter. The capture itself was accomplished without violence or apparent malice, but with the sort of professional competence that suggested extensive experience in apprehending uncooperative subjects. The beings seemed to understand that Villas Boas's flight was motivated by fear rather than hostility, and they responded with restraint rather than aggression. They treated him more like a startled animal that needed to be calmed than an enemy that needed to be subdued. Their handling was firm but gentle, suggesting either a naturally pacific disposition or specific instructions to avoid harming their human subject. This restraint would characterize their behavior throughout the encounter that followed. What happened next, according to Villas Boas, was an experience that would challenge every assumption about interspecies diplomacy and the presumed clinical nature of alien scientific interest in human beings. He was, he reported, escorted aboard the spacecraft, where he found himself in an environment that was simultaneously advanced and oddly utilitarian. The interior of the craft was like being inside a machine designed by beings who had mastered technology, but perhaps never quite grasped the concept of interior decoration. Everything was functional, efficient, and utterly alien in its design principles, yet somehow familiar in its basic organization of space and equipment. The interior was illuminated by the same reddish light that had surrounded the exterior, giving everything an otherworldly glow that probably did nothing to calm his already elevated stress levels. The walls appeared to be constructed of a smooth metallic material that curved organically rather than meeting at sharp angles, creating spaces that felt both enclosed and oddly open. The normal rules of architecture seem to have been abandoned in favour of principles that served different purposes, perhaps related to the craft's method of propulsion, or the physiological needs of its usual occupants. The overall effect was disorienting but not claustrophobic, suggesting sophisticated understanding of environmental psychology, even if applied according to non-human preferences. The air inside the craft had a distinctive quality that Villas Boas found difficult to describe but never forgot. It was breathable, but somehow wrong, with a density and chemical composition that made him feel lightheaded and nauseous. The atmospheric differences might have been intentional, designed to make human subjects more docile and manageable, or they might simply have reflected the aliens' different physiological requirements and their lack of concern for human comfort. The beings conducted what appeared to be a medical examination, taking samples of his blood through procedures that he described as surprisingly gentle, though no less invasive for their careful execution. The medical instruments they used were unlike anything in his experience, operating without apparent power sources and producing results through methods that seemed to combine advanced technology with what might charitably be called magic. The blood sampling procedure involved the use of what appeared to be a small, cup-like device that was applied to various parts of his body, creating suction that drew blood through his skin without the need for needles or incisions. The process was uncomfortable but not particularly painful, suggesting either advanced medical technology or extensive experience in conducting such procedures on unwilling subjects. Throughout the medical examination, the beings maintained a clinical detachment that suggested this was routine procedure rather than groundbreaking scientific research. They showed no excitement or particular interest in Villas Boas as an individual, treating him more like a laboratory specimen than a representative of an alien species. Their efficiency and lack of emotional response suggested that they had conducted similar examinations many times before. The medical examination appeared to focus particularly on his reproductive system, with special attention paid to areas that would be relevant to genetic sampling and biological compatibility assessment. The beings seemed to possess detailed knowledge of human anatomy, conducting their examination with the sort of precision that suggested either extensive prior study of human physiology or direct experience with human subjects. This familiarity with human biology would prove to be significant in light of what would happen next. Now, in most alien encounter reports, this would be the extent of the interaction. A brief examination, perhaps some telepathic communication about the future of humanity, and then a return to the field with gaps in memory and a story no one would believe. But Villas Boas's account was only beginning to venture into truly unprecedented territory. After the medical examination, according to his testimony, the beings left him alone in what appeared to be a waiting room or preparation chamber. The room was sparse and functional, containing only a bed-like platform and some unidentifiable equipment that hummed quietly in the background. He reported, feeling distinctly unwell, experiencing nausea and a peculiar burning sensation in his eyes from the strange atmospheric conditions aboard the craft. The waiting period seemed designed to allow him to acclimate to the alien environment while the beings prepared for whatever would happen next. During this time, Villas Boas reported feeling increasingly drowsy and disoriented, as if he had been given some form of sedative or mood-altering substance. His ability to think clearly and make rational decisions seemed to be gradually compromised, leaving him in a state of confused compliance that would characterize the remainder of his time aboard the craft. Part 3. The Encounter's Intimate Turn. It was at this point that the encounter took a turn that would make it unique in the annals of alleged alien contact. A door opened, and into the chamber walked, or perhaps glided, the accounts are unclear on this point, a female being who was, in Villas Boas's description, unmistakably not of terrestrial origin, yet somehow remarkably attractive by human standards. She was shorter than the other beings he had encountered, standing perhaps 4.5 feet tall, with lighter-coloured skin that seemed to have an almost luminescent quality in the reddish lighting of the spacecraft. Her hair was long and flowing, appearing almost silver or platinum blonde in colour, and moved as if floating in water rather than hanging normally under the influence of gravity. Her facial features were delicate and symmetrical, but somehow too perfect, as if designed by someone who understood human aesthetics, but had never actually seen a human face up close. Her eyes were larger than normal human proportions, but not grotesquely so, and they seemed to convey intelligence and awareness that was both alien and somehow familiar. Most remarkably, she appeared to be entirely unclothed, a detail that Villas Boas reported with the sort of clinical precision that characterized his entire account. Her body was humanoid in its basic structure, but subtly different in proportions and details, suggesting either genetic modification or simply evolution according to different environmental pressures than those that had shaped human development. Her skin had an unusual quality that seemed to reflect light differently than human skin, creating an almost ethereal appearance that was enhanced by the strange lighting conditions inside the spacecraft. Her movements possessed a fluid grace that seemed to ignore normal considerations of gravity and momentum, as if she were moving through a medium less dense than air. What happened next, according to Villas Boas, was an encounter of the very personal kind that would make his story infamous among researchers of anomalous phenomena and presumably very awkward at family gatherings for decades to come. The female being, it appeared, had not come to discuss the weather or exchange cultural information about their respective planets. The female being approached him with what appeared to be purposeful intent, her movements combining grace with unmistakable determination. She communicated not through words, but through actions and gestures that transcended language barriers, making her intentions clear through a combination of physical contact and what seemed to be some form of telepathic influence that bypassed normal conscious thought processes. Villas Boas maintained throughout his life that what occurred was a deliberate act of interspecies reproduction, conducted with a purpose and methodology that suggested this was not a casual encounter, but rather a carefully planned biological experiment. The female being, he reported, made her intentions unmistakably clear, through actions rather than words, and proved remarkably skilled at overcoming any language barriers that might have complicated the proceedings. The encounter was, according to his detailed testimony, both physically intense and emotionally confusing. Villas Boas found himself responding to the female being despite his fear and confusion, suggesting either that the aliens possessed sophisticated knowledge of human psychology and physiology, or that they were capable of manipulating human responses through technological or telepathic means. The physical aspects of the encounter were, in Villas Boas's description, remarkably similar to human intimate behaviour, but with subtle differences that reinforced the alien nature of his partner. Her responses to their interaction included sounds that he described as similar to the barking communication he had heard from the other beings, a detail that adds a certain surreal quality to what was already an unprecedented situation in the history of alleged human-alien contact. The female being's behaviour throughout the encounter suggested a combination of genuine physical pleasure and clinical scientific purpose. She seemed to be experiencing the interaction on multiple levels simultaneously, responding emotionally and physically while also maintaining the sort of detached awareness that suggested she was monitoring the encounter for specific scientific or reproductive outcomes. The duration of their intimate encounter was, according to Villas Boas, approximately 1 hour, during which they engaged in multiple acts of physical intimacy with what seemed to be systematic thoroughness. The female being appeared to be ensuring that their interaction would achieve maximum probability of reproductive success, suggesting that conception, rather than mere physical pleasure, was the primary goal of the encounter. Throughout the encounter, Villas Boas reported experiencing sensations and emotions that were both familiar and strange, as if his normal human responses were being amplified or modified by some external influence. He felt simultaneously attracted to and disturbed by his alien partner, experiencing desire and revulsion in equal measure as his conscious mind struggled to process an experience for which evolution had not prepared him. Following their intimate encounter, the female being apparently underwent what can only be described as a moment of genuine emotion. She pointed to her stomach, then to the sky, and then to Villas Boas himself, in what he interpreted as an indication that their union had been successful in its apparent reproductive purpose, and that any resulting offspring would be raised far from Earth. This gesture, perhaps more than any other aspect of the encounter, convinced Villas Boas that he had participated in something far more significant than simple physical contact. The female being's communication suggested not only that conception had occurred, but that their offspring would play some role in larger plans that extended far beyond Earth and involved the future relationship between human and alien civilizations. It's unclear what species etiquette was in play here, but she made her intentions and the intended consequences of their meeting unmistakably clear. Villas Boas reported feeling a complex mixture of satisfaction, confusion, and what might charitably be described as interplanetary performance anxiety, having apparently been selected for a biological mission he had never applied for. The emotional complexity of this moment cannot be overstated. Villas Boas found himself simultaneously proud of his apparent fertility and genetic desirability, disturbed by the implications of unknowing participation in an alien breeding program, and confused about his own emotional responses to an experience that combined violation with what seemed to be genuine affection from his alien partner. After this remarkable interlude, the other beings returned and conducted Villas Boas on what appeared to be a brief tour of their spacecraft, showing him various controls and mechanisms that he observed with the careful attention of someone who was either genuinely curious about alien technology or desperately trying to memorize details that would make his eventual testimony more convincing. The tour included visits to what appeared to be the craft's power source, navigation systems and living quarters, all designed according to principles that owed nothing to human engineering traditions, but seemed to function with remarkable efficiency. The beings explained various systems through a combination of gestures and what seemed to be direct mental communication, though much of the technical information was too advanced for Villas Boas to understand or retain. The power source appeared to be some form of energy conversion system that operated without fuel or moving parts, generating the electrical and propulsive forces needed for interstellar travel through methods that seemed to violate basic principles of physics. The energy source hummed with a resonance that he could feel in his bones, suggesting forces and frequencies beyond human comprehension. The navigation systems included displays that showed star patterns and planetary positions in three-dimensional detail, suggesting mapping capabilities that encompassed vast regions of the galaxy. The star charts were unlike anything Villas Boas had ever seen, with symbols and notations in scripts that bore no resemblance to any human writing system. The living quarters were sparse and functional, designed for beings who apparently had little need for privacy or personal possessions. The sleeping areas consisted of platforms that could be adjusted for different body sizes and positions, while storage compartments contained what appeared to be food supplies, equipment, and personal items that were too alien for Villas Boas to identify or understand. Throughout the tour, the beings maintained their clinical detachment, showing him their technology with the same dispassionate efficiency they had displayed during the medical examination. They seemed neither proud of their achievements nor concerned about revealing advanced technology to a primitive human, suggesting either remarkable confidence in their security measures or complete indifference to human technological development. The beings also showed Villas Boas what appeared to be a viewing area or observation deck, through which he could see the Brazilian countryside spread out below in the pre-dawn darkness. The sight of his familiar world from this impossible perspective drove home the reality of his situation, in a way that all the alien technology and unusual beings had not quite accomplished. From this elevated vantage point, his family's farm looked small and insignificant against the vast landscape, a reminder of how isolated and vulnerable he was in his current circumstances. The view also provided him with a reference point for understanding the craft's altitude and position, details that would later prove useful to investigators attempting to verify his account. The beings then escorted him back to the field where his tractor waited, still refusing to start, as if it too had been affected by the evening's extraordinary events. The spacecraft departed with the same silence and impossible speed that had characterized its arrival, leaving Villas Boas alone in the pre-dawn darkness with his broken tractor and a story that would challenge the credulity of investigators for generations to come. The departure was as sudden and mysterious as the arrival had been. The craft simply rose from the field without sound or visible propulsion, accelerated to impossible speeds within seconds, and disappeared into the night sky as if it had never been there. Only the physical evidence of landing marks in the ploughed soil and Villas Boas's own condition provided proof that anything unusual had occurred. When Villas Boas finally managed to return home, after his tractor mysteriously resumed normal operation several hours later, he discovered that nearly 4 hours had passed since the encounter began, though to him it had seemed like perhaps an hour or two at most. The time discrepancy was one of many puzzling aspects of the experience that would never be fully explained, suggesting either gaps in his memory or some form of temporal manipulation that affected his perception of duration. More significantly, he began experiencing physical symptoms that he had never encountered before: severe headaches, nausea, lesions on his skin, and a general feeling of illness that persisted for several days. The symptoms were consistent with exposure to some form of radiation or toxic substances, though no terrestrial source for such exposure could be identified. The skin lesions appeared primarily on his arms and face, areas that had been exposed during his time aboard the spacecraft. They resembled burns, but without the characteristic patterns of thermal or chemical injury, suggesting exposure to some form of energy or substance that was unknown to terrestrial medicine. The lesions healed slowly and left permanent scars that served as physical reminders of his extraordinary experience. The illness that followed the encounter was particularly puzzling because it seemed to combine elements of radiation sickness with symptoms that had no known medical explanation. Villas Boas experienced fatigue, nausea, and weakness that persisted for weeks, along with recurring nightmares and a general sense of unease that suggested psychological as well as physical trauma. Perhaps most remarkably, Villas Boas did not immediately publicize his experience. He confided in a few family members and friends, but made no effort to contact newspapers or researchers. The decision to remain silent was motivated partly by fear of ridicule and partly by uncertainty about whether anyone would believe such an extraordinary story. The silence that followed his encounter was characteristic of many individuals who report extraordinary experiences that challenge conventional understanding of reality. Villas Boas understood instinctively that his story would be met with skepticism, ridicule, and possibly serious consequences for his reputation and livelihood in a conservative rural community. It was only months later, when he heard about other similar encounters being reported in Brazil and elsewhere, that he decided to come forward with his story, first to a local journalist and eventually to Dr. Olavo Fontes, a respected physician and researcher who would document the case in extraordinary detail. The delay in reporting actually strengthened his credibility, as it suggested genuine reluctance to seek publicity, rather than a desire for attention or fame. Dr. Fontes was a well-regarded medical professional with an interest in anomalous phenomena who had developed a reputation for careful scientific investigation of unusual claims. His examination of Villas Boas was thorough and professional, combining medical assessment with detailed questioning about every aspect of the alleged encounter. Dr. Fontes found Villas Boas to be a credible witness with no apparent motive for fabrication, no history of mental illness, and a remarkable consistency in his account even under intensive questioning. The physical symptoms that Villas Boas had experienced were, according to Dr. Fontes, consistent with exposure to some form of radiation, though the source of such exposure remained unexplained. The medical examination conducted by Dr. Fontes revealed not only the scarring from the post-encounter skin lesions, but also other physical evidence that supported Villas Boas's account. Blood tests showed unusual cellular activity consistent with recent radiation exposure, while psychological evaluation revealed stress patterns typical of individuals who had experienced genuine trauma rather than those who had fabricated false memories. The case of Antonio Villas Boas would become a cornerstone in the study of alleged alien encounters, notable not only for its intimate nature, but for the wealth of specific details, the credibility of the witness, and the physical evidence in the form of his post-encounter illness. It was also the first well-documented case to suggest that alien interest in humanity might extend beyond simple observation or even medical examination into the realm of biological collaboration. The reproductive aspects of the encounter established a pattern that would be repeated in many subsequent alien contact reports, suggesting either a coordinated program of human-alien hybridization or the persistence of certain psychological and cultural themes in the interpretation of anomalous experiences. The case became a template for later encounters involving intimate contact and reproductive themes. Villas Boas himself went on to live a relatively normal life, eventually becoming a lawyer and raising a family of entirely terrestrial origin. He maintained his story consistently throughout his life, never seeking to profit from his experience and never backing down from the details that made his account so remarkable and so difficult to believe. His later career as a lawyer demonstrated the intellectual capacity and attention to detail that characterized his approach to the alien encounter, lending additional credibility to his testimony. Colleagues and clients found him to be reliable, rational, and possessed of the sort of analytical mind that would be unlikely to fabricate elaborate fantasies or maintain false beliefs for decades. Whether one believes his story or not, it remains a watershed moment in the history of reported human-alien contact, the first detailed account of an encounter that went far beyond the clinical and ventured into territory that was deeply, uncomfortably, and unforgettably personal. Part 4. The Australian Bedroom Visitor, Peter Khoury, 1992. Our second tale takes us across the decades and around the world to the suburban tranquility of Sydney, Australia, where 35 years after Villas Boas's Brazilian encounter, a Lebanese-Australian man would experience an encounter that redefined the concept of uninvited house guests and challenged every assumption about the privacy of one's own bedroom. Peter Khoury was a 47-year-old builder living in the Greenacre district of Sydney, leading the sort of settled domestic life that included a wife, children, mortgage payments, and the reasonable expectation that his bedroom would remain free of unauthorized extraterrestrial visitors. He had no particular interest in unidentified flying objects, no history of unusual experiences, and no apparent reason to fabricate a story that would subject him to decades of scrutiny from researchers, skeptics, and individuals with overly active imaginations. The Greenacre district where Cury lived was a typical suburban neighbourhood, characterised by modest family homes, well-maintained gardens, and the sort of quiet respectability that attracts families seeking stability and privacy. It was not the sort of location where one would expect extraordinary events to unfold, lacking the remote isolation of rural farms or the dramatic landscapes often associated with alleged alien encounters. Cury's background as a builder reflected the practical, hands-on approach to life that characterized his entire personality. He was accustomed to working with concrete materials, solving tangible problems, and dealing with the sort of straightforward challenges that required physical skills rather than imaginative speculation. His profession demanded attention to detail, reliability, and the ability to distinguish between solid construction and elaborate facades, qualities that would later prove relevant to evaluating the credibility of his extraordinary claims. The Lebanese-Australian community in Sydney was tight-knit and family-oriented, with strong cultural traditions that emphasised practical achievement, family responsibility, and scepticism toward claims that could not be verified through direct experience. Cury was fully integrated into this community, with social connections and cultural values that provided no incentive for fabricating unusual stories that might bring unwanted attention or ridicule. In the years leading up to his encounter, Cury had lived what could only be described as an entirely conventional life. He worked regular hours in the construction industry, participated in family gatherings and community events, and showed no interest in science fiction, paranormal phenomena, or anything that might predispose him toward believing in or fabricating accounts of alien contact. His reading material consisted of trade publications, newspapers, and the sort of practical manuals that helped him maintain professional competence in his chosen field. The events that would transform Cury from anonymous suburban builder to reluctant participant in one of the most controversial alien encounter cases in modern history began on the morning of July 23, 1992. The date was significant only in retrospect. At the time, it seemed like an ordinary Thursday morning in an ordinary Australian winter, with nothing to suggest that the day would conclude with events that would challenge every assumption about the nature of reality and the security of domestic spaces. Cury had been feeling unwell for several days, suffering from what appeared to be a combination of influenza and work-related exhaustion that had left him feeling tired, nauseous, and generally run down. The decision to stay home from work was motivated by practical considerations rather than any premonition of extraordinary events. He simply felt too ill to operate heavy machinery or maintain the sort of focus that construction work required for safety reasons. His wife had left the house early to attend to family obligations, leaving Cury alone with instructions to rest and recover his strength. The house was quiet and peaceful, with the sort of domestic tranquility that suburban families consider normal and desirable. The bedroom where he was resting faced east, allowing morning sunlight to filter through curtains that had been drawn to create the sort of dim, restful environment conducive to recovery from illness. At approximately 7:30 in the morning, according to Cury's detailed later testimony, he was lying in bed in that drowsy state between sleep and wakefulness when he became aware that he was no longer alone in the room. The realization came gradually, beginning with a vague sense that something had changed in the room's atmosphere, followed by the more definite awareness that additional presences had somehow appeared beside his bed without making any sound that would have alerted him to their arrival. The silence of their approach was perhaps the most unsettling aspect of their initial appearance. Cury was accustomed to the sounds of suburban life, traffic, neighbours, the normal creaking and settling of house construction. The complete absence of any auditory warning that strangers had entered his bedroom suggested either remarkable stealth capabilities or methods of movement that operated according to principles entirely different from normal human locomotion. Two female figures had somehow appeared beside his bed, standing close enough that he could observe them in detail despite the dim lighting in the room. Their presence was so unexpected and so inexplicable that Cury initially wondered if he might be experiencing some form of fever-induced hallucination, a reasonable first response given his recent illness and the inherent impossibility of what he was observing. The figures were, in Cury's description, unmistakably feminine in their general proportions, but distinctly non-human in their specific features and characteristics. They appeared to be entirely unclothed, which seemed like a questionable choice for a first contact scenario, but perhaps reflected different cultural standards regarding appropriate attire for interdimensional bedroom visits, or possibly indicated complete indifference to human concepts of modesty and social propriety. The first figure was tall and slender, standing perhaps 5.5 feet in height, with pale skin that seemed to have an almost translucent quality, as if light could penetrate slightly below the surface before being reflected back. Her hair was so blonde it appeared nearly white in the morning sunlight filtering through the bedroom windows, and it moved as if floating in water rather than hanging normally under the influence of gravity. Her facial features were delicate and symmetrical, but somehow too perfect, as if designed by someone who understood human aesthetics, but had never actually seen a human face up close. The proportions were almost but not quite human, with subtle differences in the spacing of features and the curves of bone structure that created an unsettling uncanny valley effect. Her beauty was undeniable, but somehow artificial, like a sculpture created by an artist who had studied human appearance without fully understanding its natural variations. The second figure was shorter and more conventionally human in her proportions, standing approximately 5 feet tall with darker skin that suggested either Asian heritage or perhaps an entirely different ethnic background that had no terrestrial equivalent. Her black hair contrasted sharply with her companion's ethereal appearance, and her facial features were more familiar, almost Asian in their characteristics. But there remained something subtly wrong about her appearance that Cury found difficult to articulate but impossible to ignore. Both figures possessed eyes that were larger than normal human proportions would suggest. Not grotesquely so, but noticeably different in a way that suggested either genetic modification or simply evolution, according to different environmental pressures than those that had shaped human development. Their eyes seemed to convey intelligence and awareness that was both alien and somehow familiar, as if they possessed knowledge of human nature that exceeded what most humans understood about themselves. The way they moved was perhaps even more unsettling than their unusual appearance. They seemed to glide rather than walk, their movements possessing a fluid grace that suggested either advanced physical training or a completely different relationship with gravity and inertia than that experienced by terrestrial beings. Every gesture seemed purposeful and controlled, as if they were constantly aware of their physical presence and capable of adjusting their movements with supernatural precision. Both figures observed Cury with expressions that suggested both curiosity and familiarity, as if they had been studying him for some time, and were now ready to proceed with whatever purpose had brought them to his suburban Sydney bedroom. Their gaze was clinical, yet somehow personal, combining the detached observation of scientists with what seemed to be genuine interest in him as an individual rather than merely as a representative specimen of his species. The atmosphere in the room seemed to change with their presence, becoming charged with an energy that Cury found difficult to describe but impossible to ignore. The air felt thicker, more electric, as if it were carrying information or influences that his normal senses could not quite process. The quality of light also seemed different, taking on properties that made ordinary objects appear somehow more vivid and defined than usual. Now, most people discovering uninvited visitors in their bedroom would reasonably be expected to respond with alarm, calls for help, or at minimum some strongly worded questions about home invasion protocols. Cury, however, found himself unable to move or speak, as if his nervous system had been temporarily disconnected from his voluntary control systems, leaving him conscious and aware but completely unable to respond to the unprecedented situation unfolding beside his bed. The paralysis was complete but not uncomfortable, more like the natural immobility that accompanies deep sleep than the forced restraint that might result from physical bonds or chemical sedation. Cury remained fully conscious and capable of detailed observation, but his body seemed to have been placed in a state of temporary suspension that prevented any voluntary movement or vocalization. This enforced passivity allowed him to observe the beings with the sort of detailed attention that would have been impossible if he'd been free to move or attempt escape. Every aspect of their appearance and behavior was recorded in his memory with photographic clarity, creating the foundation for the remarkably detailed testimony he would later provide to researchers and investigators. The taller figure approached him with what appeared to be purposeful intent, her movements combining grace with unmistakable determination. She climbed onto the bed with movements that were both graceful and somehow predatory, like a cat that had decided to take a particularly close interest in a helpless mouse. Her intentions became unmistakably clear as she positioned herself over Cury with the sort of direct approach that left no room for misinterpretation about her immediate goals. What happened next was, according to Cury's testimony, an encounter of the most intimate kind, conducted without invitation, negotiation, or any of the preliminary social interactions that typically precede such activities between members of the same species, let alone different planetary populations. The experience was, he reported, both physically intense and deeply disturbing, combining elements of pleasure with profound violation that left him confused about his own responses. The encounter proceeded with what appeared to be scientific methodology, overlaid with unmistakably biological purposes. The taller figure conducted herself with the sort of focused determination that suggested this was not a casual romantic encounter, but rather a carefully planned reproductive mission, though the specific purposes and expected outcomes remained unclear to Cury, who was still struggling with his inability to move or communicate. Throughout the intimate interaction, Cury found himself responding physically despite his psychological resistance and confusion. The being seemed to possess sophisticated knowledge of human physiology and psychology, manipulating his responses through methods that combined physical stimulation with what appeared to be some form of telepathic or technological influence that bypassed normal conscious thought processes. The physical aspects of the encounter were remarkably similar to human sexual behavior, but with subtle differences that reinforced the alien nature of his partner. Her skin felt different from human skin, with a texture that was smoother and somehow more resilient, as if it were made of a material that was related to but not identical to human tissue. Her body temperature was slightly lower than human normal, and her responses included sounds and movements that were almost but not quite human. The encounter seemed to progress according to a predetermined pattern, as if the taller being was following specific protocols designed to achieve particular biological or scientific outcomes. Her behaviour suggested both genuine physical engagement and clinical detachment, as if she were simultaneously participating in and monitoring the interaction for data collection purposes. During the most intimate portion of their interaction, something unexpected occurred that would provide crucial physical evidence for later investigation. The taller figure, in what appeared to be either an accident or perhaps an unfamiliarity with human anatomy, caused Cury a moment of sharp pain that broke through whatever force had been restraining his movements and voice. The pain was sudden and intense, apparently caused by the being's unusual dental structure making contact with sensitive tissue in a way that human anatomy would not normally accommodate. The sensation was sharp enough to override whatever mechanism had been suppressing his voluntary nervous system, suddenly restoring his ability to move and vocalize his discomfort. Suddenly able to move and speak, Cury responded to the pain with a very human exclamation of discomfort, startling both figures who apparently had not expected their subject to regain voluntary control of his responses. In that moment of surprise and confusion, something remarkable happened that would elevate this encounter from unprovable testimony to a case with actual physical evidence. In the sudden movement and confusion that followed Cury's unexpected vocalization, the taller figure inadvertently left behind biological material, specifically hair samples that would later prove to contain some of the most unusual genetic characteristics ever documented by forensic laboratories. These samples, recovered from Cury's own body following the encounter, would become the foundation for years of scientific analysis and debate. The hair samples consisted of several strands of extremely fine, almost transparent material that appeared to be blonde in colour, but with optical properties that were unlike any human hair ever analysed. The individual strands were thinner than normal human hair but stronger and more resilient, with microscopic structures that suggested a completely different evolutionary development than that which had produced human hair follicles. The two figures, apparently startled by this turn of events, departed as suddenly and silently as they had arrived, leaving no trace of their presence except for the biological evidence and Cury's memories of an encounter that defied every assumption about the nature of bedroom privacy and interspecies protocol. The entire interaction had lasted perhaps 20 minutes, but would influence the rest of Cury's life in ways he could never have anticipated. The departure was as mysterious as the arrival had been. The beings simply seemed to fade from view, becoming progressively more transparent until they disappeared entirely, leaving Cury alone in his bedroom with no evidence of their presence, except for the biological samples and his own confused memories of an experience that challenged every assumption about the nature of reality. In the immediate aftermath of the encounter, Cury found himself dealing with a complex mixture of physical discomfort, emotional confusion, and the dawning realization that he possessed what might be the first concrete evidence of alien visitation in human history. The hair samples, which were unlike anything in his previous experience, were carefully preserved for eventual scientific analysis. The physical evidence was particularly important because it provided an objective foundation for evaluating claims that might otherwise be dismissed as psychological phenomena or elaborate fabrication. Hair samples could be analysed using established forensic techniques, subjected to genetic testing, and examined by multiple independent laboratories to verify their authenticity and determine their origins. Cury initially told no one about his experience, struggling to understand what had happened and uncertain whether anyone would believe such an extraordinary story. He conducted his own preliminary examination of the biological evidence, noting characteristics that seemed inconsistent with any human hair he had ever encountered, including unusual coloration, texture, and what appeared to be microscopic structural differences. The decision to remain silent was motivated by several factors: fear of ridicule from family and friends, concern about professional reputation, and genuine uncertainty about whether the experience had been real or some form of fever-induced hallucination. The presence of physical evidence gradually convinced him that something extraordinary had indeed occurred, but the implications were so profound that he needed time to process them psychologically. The weeks and months following the encounter were difficult for Cury, as he struggled to integrate an experience that challenged every assumption about the nature of reality while maintaining his normal routine of work and family responsibilities. The knowledge that he possessed potentially revolutionary evidence weighed heavily on him, creating a burden of responsibility that he had never sought and was not prepared to carry. Eventually, after several months of private struggle with the implications of his experience, Cury contacted researchers investigating anomalous phenomena, including Bill Chalker, a respected Australian researcher who specialised in the scientific analysis of alleged alien encounter evidence. The decision to seek professional analysis represented a significant personal risk, as it required him to reveal intimate details of his experience to strangers who might not believe his account. Bill Chalker was uniquely qualified to evaluate Cury's case, possessing both the scientific background necessary to arrange proper analysis of the biological evidence and the experience with anomalous phenomena research needed to approach the case with appropriate skepticism and objectivity. Chalker had spent years developing protocols for the scientific investigation of alleged alien encounters, and he recognized immediately that Cury's case represented a unique opportunity to subject such claims to rigorous scientific scrutiny. Chalker arranged for the hair samples to be examined by multiple independent laboratories, including facilities with expertise in forensic analysis and genetic testing. The decision to use multiple laboratories was crucial for establishing the credibility of any findings, as it would eliminate the possibility of laboratory error or bias and provide independent verification of any unusual characteristics discovered in the samples. The laboratory analysis was conducted using the most advanced techniques available in the early 1990s, including electron microscopy, DNA sequencing, and comparative genetic analysis against databases of known human and animal genetic markers. The results were subjected to multiple independent reviews to ensure accuracy and eliminate the possibility of laboratory error or contamination. The laboratory results were, to put it mildly, extraordinary. The hair samples showed characteristics that were unlike any known human genetic markers, with unusual DNA sequences and microscopic structures that defied conventional biological classification. The genetic analysis revealed markers that appeared to be partly human, but included elements that could not be matched to any known terrestrial species. The blonde hair sample, in particular, showed what geneticists described as impossible characteristics, including DNA sequences that suggested a combination of human and unknown genetic material. The mitochondrial DNA, which is inherited maternally and provides a genetic fingerprint for maternal lineage, contained markers that were consistent with certain rare human populations, but also included sequences that had no match in any terrestrial genetic database. The nuclear DNA showed even more unusual characteristics, with gene sequences that appeared to be human, but arranged in patterns that were not consistent with normal human genetic variation. Some of the genetic markers suggested European ancestry, while others indicated possible Asian heritage, but the overall pattern was unlike anything previously documented in human genetic research. Perhaps most remarkably, both hair samples showed evidence of genetic stability that was inconsistent with normal human aging processes. The telomeres, which typically shorten with age and cellular division, were unusually long and showed no signs of the degradation that characterizes normal human genetic material. This suggested either extremely young biological age or some form of genetic modification that prevented normal cellular aging. These findings were subjected to extensive peer review and independent verification, with samples examined by laboratories in Australia, the United States, and Europe. The consistency of the results across multiple independent analyses lent credibility to Cury's account and provided what many researchers considered the first concrete physical evidence of non-human intelligence interacting with humans at the genetic level. The genetic analysis also revealed unusual characteristics in the hair's microscopic structure, including follicle patterns that were inconsistent with human hair growth and optical properties that suggested the presence of materials or structures that do not occur in terrestrial biology. The individual hair strands showed unusual strength and flexibility that exceeded the normal range of human hair characteristics. Cury underwent extensive psychological evaluation and polygraph testing, all of which supported his credibility as a witness. He showed no signs of mental illness, no history of fabrication, and no apparent motive for creating such an elaborate deception. His consistency in recounting the details of his experience, even under intensive questioning, impressed investigators who had experience with false claims and deliberate hoaxes. The psychological evaluation revealed stress patterns typical of individuals who had experienced genuine trauma rather than those who had fabricated false memories. Cury's emotional responses to questioning about the encounter were consistent with someone who had experienced a profoundly disturbing event rather than someone who was maintaining a deliberate deception. The case of Peter Khoury became a landmark in the study of alleged alien encounters, not only because of the unusual nature of the encounter itself, but because of the physical evidence that supported his testimony. The genetic analysis of the hair samples provided scientists with their first opportunity to examine biological material that appeared to be of non-terrestrial origin, opening new avenues of research into the possibility of alien visitation. Part 5. Interpretations, Theories, and the Search for Understanding. Now that we have explored these two remarkable accounts in their full strange detail, we must grapple with the question that haunts every listener. What, exactly, are we to make of these stories? How do we process tales that seem to emerge from the intersection of science fiction and human testimony, carrying details too elaborate to dismiss and implications too profound to accept without question? The challenge of interpreting these encounters lies not only in their extraordinary nature, but in their resistance to simple categorization. They cannot be easily dismissed as hallucinations because of the physical evidence and multiple witness corroboration in some cases. They cannot be readily accepted as factual because of their violation of conventional scientific understanding. They exist in that liminal space between belief and skepticism, where the most profound mysteries of human experience tend to reside. The traditional skeptical approach to such accounts involves searching for conventional explanations that can account for the reported experiences without requiring us to accept the existence of interplanetary visitors with unusual interests in human reproduction. These explanations range from the psychological to the sociological, from the medical to the deliberate fabrication, each attempting to provide a rational framework for understanding fundamentally irrational-seeming reports. Sleep paralysis represents perhaps the most commonly proposed explanation for encounters like those reported by our witnesses. This neurological phenomenon occurs when the mind awakens while the body remains in the paralyzed state that naturally accompanies certain phases of sleep, creating a condition where individuals are conscious and aware but unable to move or speak. The experience is often accompanied by vivid hallucinations that can seem completely real to the person experiencing them. The hallucinations associated with sleep paralysis frequently involve the presence of strange beings or intruders in the bedroom, often with sexual or threatening overtones that mirror many of the elements reported in alien encounter cases. The paralysis itself would explain the inability to move or resist that characterizes many such reports, while the hallucinatory component could account for the vivid, detailed memories that witnesses retain of their experiences. The sleep paralysis hypothesis gained support from the fact that Cury's encounter occurred while he was in bed in a drowsy state. and from the reports of paralysis and bedroom visitation that characterize his experience. The phenomenon is also known to be more common during periods of illness and stress, which matches Cury's condition at the time of his encounter. However, sleep paralysis as a complete explanation faces significant challenges when applied to the specific details of these cases. The phenomenon typically lasts only minutes and rarely produces the sort of detailed, sequential memories reported by witnesses like Villas Boas and Cury. More importantly, sleep paralysis cannot account for the physical evidence associated with these cases, particularly the genetic samples recovered from Cury's encounter. The duration and complexity of the reported experiences also exceed what is typically associated with sleep paralysis episodes. Villas Boas's encounter reportedly lasted several hours and included travel aboard a spacecraft, medical examinations, and extended interaction with multiple beings. Such elaborate and extended experiences are not characteristic of sleep paralysis, which usually involves brief episodes of paralysis accompanied by simple hallucinations. Another proposed explanation involves what researchers call screen memories, false recollections that the mind creates to mask traumatic experiences that are too difficult to process or remember accurately. According to this theory, witnesses of alleged alien encounters may have experienced genuine trauma, perhaps sexual assault or other forms of abuse, but which the traumatized mind then reconstructs as alien encounters because extraterrestrial visitation is somehow more psychologically acceptable than human cruelty. The alien narrative, according to this theory, provides a framework for processing trauma that preserves the victim's sense of agency and cosmic significance, rather than confronting the brutal randomness of terrestrial violence. This explanation has the advantage of accounting for the genuine distress and physical symptoms reported by many encounter witnesses, while providing a psychological mechanism that could generate the elaborate false memories that characterize these accounts. The theory also explains why alien encounter narratives often include elements of violation and powerlessness that mirror the dynamics of sexual trauma, albeit displaced into a science fiction framework that feels safer to confront. However, the screen memory hypothesis faces its own significant challenges when applied to cases like those of Villas Boas and Cury. Both men reported their experiences to medical professionals who found no evidence of the sort of physical trauma that would be expected from the terrestrial experiences that their alien encounters would presumably be masking. Moreover, both witnesses maintained their accounts consistently over decades, showing none of the memory fragmentation or progressive revelation that typically characterizes recovered trauma memories. Cultural contamination represents another avenue of skeptical inquiry, suggesting that witnesses unconsciously incorporate elements from science fiction films, books, and media reports into their own psychological experiences, creating elaborate false memories that feel genuine but are actually constructed from culturally available narratives about alien visitation. The remarkable similarity between many encounter reports could be explained by their shared cultural sources rather than their shared extraterrestrial origins. The cultural contamination theory gained support from the observation that alien encounter reports tend to reflect the technological anxieties and sexual preoccupations of their particular historical periods. Early 20th century encounters involved simple flying machines and basic medical examinations, while later accounts incorporated more sophisticated technology and complex reproductive scenarios that mirror advances in human understanding of genetics and space travel. Yet cultural contamination, while explaining some similarities between accounts, struggles to address the specific details and physical evidence that characterize the most compelling cases. Villas Boas reported his encounter in 1957, before alien abduction narratives had become widely disseminated in popular culture, making cultural contamination an unlikely source for the specific elements of his account. Similarly, the genetic evidence associated with Cury's case suggests influences that go beyond what cultural programming could produce. The phenomenon of false memory syndrome offers another potential explanation, particularly relevant to cases where significant time passes between the alleged experience and its first detailed reporting. False memories can be extraordinarily vivid and emotionally compelling, indistinguishable from genuine memories even to the person experiencing them, and they can incorporate specific details that seem to provide evidence of their authenticity even when they are entirely fabricated by unconscious mental processes. False memory syndrome has been particularly studied in the context of recovered childhood trauma memories, where individuals develop detailed recollections of experiences that may never have occurred, complete with emotional responses and physical symptoms that seem to validate their reality. The mechanism by which false memories are created remains poorly understood, but their existence as a documented psychological phenomenon provides a potential framework for understanding even the most detailed alien encounter reports. However, the false memory explanation encounters difficulties when applied to cases where witnesses reported their experiences immediately, rather than recovering them years later, and where physical evidence exists to support aspects of their accounts. Both Villas Boas and Cury reported their experiences within relatively short periods of their occurrence, before the sort of memory reconstruction that characterizes false memory syndrome would be expected to take place. The hoax hypothesis represents the most straightforward skeptical explanation, suggesting that witnesses deliberately fabricate their accounts for reasons ranging from attention-seeking to financial gain to simple mischief. This explanation has the advantage of accounting for even the most elaborate details and apparent physical evidence, while requiring no revision of our understanding of physics, biology, or the likelihood of interplanetary visitation. Deliberate hoaxes have certainly occurred in the field of alleged alien encounters, with some cases involving elaborate props, manufactured evidence, and carefully rehearsed testimony designed to fool investigators and the public. The existence of proven hoaxes provides a precedent for dismissing other cases as similarly fraudulent, particularly when the accounts involve claims that seem to violate basic principles of scientific understanding, Yet the hoax explanation faces significant challenges when applied to cases like those we've examined. Both Villas Boas and Cury demonstrated remarkable consistency in their accounts, over decades of questioning, showed no apparent motive for fabrication, and in Cury's case, produced physical evidence that has withstood extensive scientific analysis. The psychological profiles of both witnesses suggest individuals who are psychologically stable, professionally competent, and possessed of the sort of personal integrity that would make elaborate long-term deception unlikely. The genetic evidence associated with Cury's case presents particular challenges for the hoax hypothesis. Creating fake biological samples with the sophisticated genetic characteristics documented by multiple independent laboratories would require access to advanced genetic engineering capabilities that were not widely available in the early 1990s, along with detailed knowledge of genetic analysis techniques that would enable the hoaxer to create convincing false evidence. Moving beyond conventional skeptical explanations, we encounter theories that attempt to account for these experiences while acknowledging that they may represent genuine encounters with non-human intelligence, though not necessarily in the literal sense that witnesses interpret them. These theories explore possibilities that challenge our understanding of consciousness, reality, and the nature of experience itself. The interdimensional hypothesis suggests that alleged alien encounters may represent contact with intelligent beings from parallel dimensions or alternate realities, rather than distant planets. This theory attempts to account for the seemingly impossible technologies and abilities reported by witnesses, while avoiding the vast distances and energy requirements that interstellar travel would entail, according to our current understanding of physics. Interdimensional beings would presumably possess the ability to manipulate space-time in ways that would allow them to appear and disappear at will, to alter physical matter, and to influence human consciousness through methods that would seem like advanced technology, but might actually represent mastery of dimensional physics that we do not yet understand. Their apparent interest in human reproduction might reflect interdimensional genetic compatibility, or represent research into consciousness and biology across dimensional boundaries. The interdimensional theory gained some support from quantum physics research that suggests the possible existence of parallel universes and alternate dimensions, though the application of these theoretical frameworks to alleged alien encounters requires significant speculative leaps that go far beyond established scientific understanding. The theory also provides a framework for understanding why alleged alien visitors seem to appear and disappear without leaving the sort of physical traces that conventional space travel would require. Time travel represents another non-conventional explanation that attempts to account for alien encounter reports without requiring interstellar visitors. According to this theory, the beings encountered by witnesses like Villas Boas and Cury might actually be human descendants from the future, returning to study their own genetic heritage or to conduct research that is necessary for their survival in some future timeline. Future human time travelers would possess technology that would seem impossibly advanced to contemporary observers, but their physical appearance might retain enough human characteristics to account for the humanoid features reported by most encounter witnesses. Their interest in reproduction and genetics would make perfect sense if they were studying their own evolutionary heritage or attempting to address genetic problems that had developed in their future timeline. The time travel hypothesis faces significant challenges from theoretical physics, which suggests that backward time travel, if possible at all, would involve paradoxes and energy requirements that make it highly impractical. However, recent developments in quantum mechanics and relativity theory have not definitively ruled out the possibility of limited forms of time manipulation, leaving the door open for speculative applications that could account for some aspects of reported alien encounters. Perhaps the most intriguing theoretical framework for understanding these encounters involves what researchers call the consciousness interface hypothesis. This theory suggests that alleged alien encounters may represent a form of contact between human consciousness and non-human intelligence that operates through direct mental interface rather than physical interaction in conventional space-time. According to this model, the detailed physical experiences reported by witnesses might be the way human consciousness interprets and processes contact with intelligence that exists in forms we cannot directly perceive or understand. The sexual and reproductive elements might represent the mind's attempt to translate concepts related to consciousness, fusion, information exchange, or collaborative creation into familiar biological metaphors. The consciousness interface theory could account for both the subjective reality of the experiences and the apparent physical evidence, suggesting that consciousness interaction might be capable of producing real physical effects through mechanisms that we do not yet understand. This would explain how witnesses can have genuine, detailed memories of impossible events, why some encounters produce physical evidence, and why the experiences seem to combine elements of objective reality with subjective interpretation. The military or government explanation represents a more terrestrial but equally speculative theory, suggesting that some alleged alien encounters might actually represent contact with classified human technology and personnel conducting covert research or testing. According to this theory, advanced human aircraft and genetic research programs might account for some of the seemingly impossible technologies and biological interest reported by encounter witnesses. This explanation has the advantage of not requiring extraterrestrial visitors, while still accounting for genuinely advanced technology and scientific capabilities that might seem alien to civilian observers. Government agencies have certainly conducted classified research into advanced aircraft, psychological manipulation, and biological experimentation, providing a precedent for the sort of covert activities that could generate alien encounter reports. However, the military explanation faces significant challenges when applied to cases like those we have examined. The level of technological sophistication reported by witnesses exceeds known human capabilities even today, decades after their reported encounters. Moreover, the genetic evidence associated with Cury's case suggests biological characteristics that are beyond current human genetic engineering capabilities. The most honest assessment of these extraordinary accounts may be that they represent phenomena that challenge the boundaries of our current understanding without fitting neatly into any single explanatory framework. They exist at the intersection of consciousness and physical reality, individual psychology and cultural mythology, known science and speculative possibility. What makes cases like those of Villas Boas and Cury particularly significant is not necessarily their literal truth or falsehood, but their role in expanding our conception of what might be possible in terms of human experience and our relationship with unknown aspects of reality. They force us to confront the limitations of our current scientific paradigms while acknowledging the profound mysteries that continue to surround consciousness, perception, and the nature of reality itself. Whether these encounters represent contact with extraterrestrial visitors, interdimensional beings, time travelers, consciousness phenomena we do not yet understand, or elaborate psychological constructions, they serve as reminders that human experience continues to produce mysteries that resist simple explanation and challenge our assumptions about the nature of existence. Part 6. The enduring mystery and the questions that remain. As we reach the conclusion of these remarkable tales, we find ourselves not with neat answers, but with an expanded appreciation for the complexity of human experience and the persistence of mystery in an age that promises scientific explanation for all phenomena. The stories of Antonio Villas Boas and Peter Khoury continue to perplex researchers, challenge skeptics, and inspire wonder in those who encounter their detailed testimonies. The enduring fascination with these cases lies not simply in their extraordinary claims, but in their resistance to easy categorization or dismissal. They possess too many verifiable details to be comfortably dismissed as pure fantasy. Yet they require us to accept possibilities that stretch the boundaries of scientific understanding to the breaking point. They exist in that liminal space where mystery and reality intersect, demanding consideration while defying conventional analysis. Both cases continue to generate research and debate more than half a century after they were first reported, with new analytical techniques occasionally providing fresh insights into old questions. The genetic evidence from Cury's encounter continues to be studied as laboratory capabilities advance, while researchers apply new methodologies to the psychological and sociological aspects of Villas Boas's detailed testimony. The broader implications of these encounters extend far beyond the specific details of individual experiences. They represent challenges to fundamental assumptions about human isolation in the universe, the nature of consciousness and perception, and the boundaries between subjective experience and objective reality. They force us to confront the possibility that reality might be far stranger and more complex than our current scientific paradigms suggest. Perhaps most significantly, these cases highlight the profound questions that continue to surround human consciousness and its relationship to the physical world. Whether the encounters represent contact with non-human intelligence, manifestations of consciousness phenomena we do not yet understand, or elaborate psychological constructions, they demonstrate the remarkable capacity of human experience to generate mysteries that resist simple explanation. The reproductive themes that characterize both encounters raise particularly intriguing questions about the relationship between consciousness, biology, and identity. The focus on genetic material and reproductive compatibility suggests either genuine scientific interest from non-human intelligence or profound psychological connections between sexuality, identity, and our place in the cosmos that manifest in these extraordinary narratives. The physical evidence associated with these cases continues to represent one of the most compelling aspects of encounter research. While skeptics can reasonably question the interpretation of such evidence, its existence provides an objective foundation for investigation, that transcends the purely testimonial nature of most extraordinary claims. The genetic samples from Cury's case, in particular, continue to challenge conventional understanding of what such evidence should reveal. The witnesses themselves have become integral parts of the mystery, their personal characteristics and life trajectories providing additional data for understanding the nature of their reported experiences. Both Villas Boas and Cury lived long, productive lives after their encounters, maintaining their stories consistently while demonstrating the sort of psychological stability and personal integrity that lends credibility to their testimonies. The cultural impact of these cases extends far beyond the immediate circles of researchers and enthusiasts who study them directly. They have influenced literature, film, and popular culture's conception of alien contact, contributing to a narrative framework that shapes how subsequent encounters are interpreted and reported. They represent foundational texts in the modern mythology of human-alien interaction. The scientific community's response to these cases reflects broader tensions between the desire for empirical understanding and the resistance to phenomena that challenge established paradigms. While mainstream science generally dismisses such accounts, the detailed documentation and physical evidence associated with the most compelling cases continue to attract serious researchers who recognize their potential significance for understanding consciousness and anomalous phenomena. The psychological dimensions of these encounters raise profound questions about the nature of memory, perception, and the construction of narrative identity. Whether the experiences represent contact with non-human intelligence or elaborate psychological phenomena, they demonstrate the remarkable capacity of human consciousness to create detailed, emotionally compelling narratives that feel entirely real to those who experience them. The intimate nature of both encounters adds layers of complexity that distinguish them from more conventional contact scenarios. The reproductive themes suggest either genuine scientific interest from advanced intelligence or deep psychological connections between sexuality, identity, and cosmic significance that manifest in these extraordinary personal experiences. As sleep gently begins to claim your consciousness, consider the possibility that reality might be far stranger and more wonderful than our daily experience suggests. Whether the stories of Villas Boas and Cury represent contact with beings from distant stars, parallel dimensions, future timelines, or the remarkable depths of human consciousness itself, they remind us that mystery continues to exist in our scientific age. The universe remains vast and largely unexplored, filled with possibilities that our current understanding can barely imagine. Consciousness itself remains one of the deepest mysteries of existence, its relationship to physical reality still poorly understood despite centuries of philosophical and scientific investigation. In this context, encounters like those we have explored serve as reminders of how much remains unknown. Perhaps the greatest value of these extraordinary accounts lies not in determining their literal truth or falsehood, but in their capacity to expand our conception of what might be possible in terms of human experience and our relationship with the unknown aspects of reality. They challenge us to remain open to mystery while maintaining appropriate skepticism, to seek understanding while acknowledging the limitations of our current knowledge. As you drift towards sleep, let your mind rest in the comfortable uncertainty that surrounds these eternal questions. Whether we are alone in the universe or part of a vast community of intelligence, whether consciousness is purely biological or connected to larger patterns of existence, whether reality is as solid and predictable as it appears or far stranger than we currently imagine, the mystery continues to unfold around us. The stories of intimate encounters from beyond remind us that even in our age of scientific explanation, human experience continues to generate mysteries that challenge our understanding and expand our sense of what might be possible. In embracing these mysteries without needing to solve them completely, we maintain our capacity for wonder and our openness to possibilities that our current knowledge cannot fully encompass. Rest now in the knowledge that mystery surrounds us, that reality might be far more interesting than it appears, and that human consciousness remains one of the most remarkable phenomena in a universe full of wonders we're only beginning to understand. Let these thoughts carry you gently into dreams where anything might be possible, and the boundaries between the known and unknown dissolve into peaceful sleep. Sweet dreams, and remember, the universe is under no obligation to make sense to us, and perhaps that's exactly as it should be.